First, some thanks to Giovanni Panisi for inviting me to. Yeah, let me just make sure that we've started properly. First, thanks to Giovanni Panisi for inviting me to talk about the short book here on embodied and enactive approaches to cognition. I'm going to talk about the 4 E's in cognitive science and try to give you a summary of some of the things that you'll find in the book. First, let me say that if we were to judge a book by its cover, then I think the Italian translation is actually much better than the original English, given that it's a much nicer cover. And there are also some additions to the Italian edition, and they include a preface and an introduction that gives you more the general sense of what's going on in the book. The book itself is a very short introduction to the area of embodied cognition, including philosophical and scientific approaches that range from narrow brain-based views to wider perspectives that take environmental factors, including social factors, seriously. So 4E cognition, of course, means embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive approaches. These are different approaches that share certain elements and conflict in other ways. The book tries to give an account of each of these, the similarities and the differences, the debates, the disagreements, the arguments, which I think really mark this as a lively and rich research agenda. We shouldn't focus too much on the disagreements, I think, but try to see this as a general approach to cognition where there is an ongoing lively debate. There is, in fact, as I present them in the book, a spectrum of debates, starting with external critics. So people who defend cognitivism or representationalism, people who are concerned about the distinction between causality and constitution, people who want to see how embodied and enactive approaches can scale up to take care of higher order type thinking. So there are definitely those kind of external debates that we consider. We also take a look at certain internal debates among the 4 E's. As I said, the 4 E's are not all coherently consistent in agreement. So, for example, they might disagree about the meaning of embodiment, the differences between ecological and extended and an active coupling. What does coupling mean? Coupling of body with environment, brain with body, and so forth. They might have different meanings in these different approaches. Also, even within one approach, the extended approach or the enactive approach, you'll find disagreements and debates. So there are 3 waves of extended cognition that seem to modify one another or disagree with one another on certain questions. There are also different versions of enactive cognition that one could consider. So I try to outline these differences in the book. Generally, I adopt a pragmatic strategy, building on what I take to be the most productive insights from all of the 4 E's, bracketing the controversies that seem to be unresolvable, either because the evidence is not yet available or because the theoretical terrain remains overly contested. This will seem to some as avoidance or an attempt to settle the debates too quickly by simply bracketing the problems. So, for example, the very large problem of representation. Do we have to solve that in this book? I say, let's just discuss it, but not necessarily aim to solve it. So the pragmatic strategy is not to resolve the representation wars, but to consider what recent discussions of, for example, structural representations or deflated representations, what these discussions can offer, without thinking that this fully settles the debate. In fact, we could say it extends the debate. The original English Cambridge edition was, by design, limited in word count and page count. So some topics were quite abbreviated, and that's just the nature of that particular edition. In his introduction, Cisco Parisi expands the analysis to consider how 4E cognition can apply, for example, to media studies. And he says much more than I could say in my extremely short conclusion, where I do consider very briefly some practical implications and applications. To follow Cisco's example, let me expand, again briefly, on just one of the examples I mentioned in the conclusion, the application of 4E cognition to economics. As you may know, from strict neoclassical economic views in decision theory to Herbert Simon's slightly more liberal notions of bounded rationality, including some of its more recent interpretations in, for example, Turvey and Kahneman. Economics has been developed in methodological, individualist, internalist, cognitivist, theoretical frameworks. That's where neoclassical approaches sort of take their bearing from a kind of classic cognitivist view. Simon, for example, explicitly rejected embodied, situated conceptions of cognition, even as he paid lip service to the notion of the environment as a source of uncertainty. The notion of bounded rationality includes the uncertainty the environment poses. Now, one place to look for a challenge to these cognitivist views is in the area of institutional economics. But then it turns out that what's called the new institutional economics, represented in the work of Douglas North, for example, methodologically relies on its internalist neoclassical roots. So, according to North, institutions are equivalent to internal shared mental models. Now, a first crack in this cognitivist armor occurs in the late 1990s when Andy Clark engages with North and introduces him to the extended mind hypothesis. And that sort of represents one small step outside of the usual orbit for the decision maker, and one large step away from the internalist view of Homo economicus. Now, in the past several years, my co-authors, who include Enrico Petracca and Antonio Mastrogiorgio and Guido Baggio, and I have been pointing to the important differences between Clark's first wave extended mind theory and the more pragmatic versions of enactive cognition and their implications for institutional economics. Generally, the question is, how should we think of economic rationality or economic reasoning if it is embodied and enactive and deeply embedded in the social and cultural environment? How should we think of decision-making if we abandon methodological individualism and consider the primacy of social interaction, the role of habitual behavior, and sedimented institutional practices rather than internal mental models or representations? So one thing we try to do in our work is move beyond the extended mind hypothesis to frame things in terms of the socially inactive extended mind, or SEM. And there's a contrast that we develop between Andy Clark's work on the extended mind, as he applies it to institutional economics, and our own work on a more inactive approach, or the SEM approach, SEM approach. So, for example, if we think about the nature of a cognitive institution, an extended mind, it's limited to an institution that scaffolds our cognition or that constrains our cognition. On the inactive view, we emphasize more symbiotic processes, more dynamical processes that are not simply constraints, but rather involve interactions with agents and institutions. If we look at this from the individual perspective, what we have in the extended mind view are simply a set of mental models, or at another extreme, the elimination of the agent in what are called zero intelligent agents. In contrast, on the inactive view, we emphasize habitual practices, not so much narrow cognitivist processes in the head, but habitual practices that involve bodily action within the environment. And with respect to environmental coupling, in the extended mind view, what we have are individual couplings as in the same way we might couple with tools. Whereas the emphasis on inactive SEM approaches, the emphasis is on social interaction with others. And finally, with respect to the question of relationality, we have, on the extended mind view, functional equivalence or integration, depending upon whether we're talking about first wave or second wave extended mind. Whereas on the inactive view, we focus on the notion of task dependency, the idea that in an institution, there are many different functions taken up by different roles played by others. And in the social interaction between those others, the tasks get accomplished. So that's a slightly different view from simply using a tool or having an institution operate as a constraint on our cognition. Well, look, there's much more to say about this application of embodied and inactive approaches to institutional economics. Here are some references, some recent papers by myself and my co-authors. And we have coming up a couple of books, one an co-authored book on right now entitled The Economic Spectrum, and another also in preparation, a collection of essays on 4E economics. So this is just one area of ongoing research, I think very much influenced by 4E cognition. But it's only one among a number of research areas that I merely mention in the book. So in that conclusion, I talk about applications in the area of education, literature and the humanities, performance studies, architecture, psychiatry and clinical reasoning, medical practices. And again, only briefly, I indicated in the preface to the Italian edition, some ongoing work on 4E approaches and artificial intelligence. On that respect, let me mention that I've just returned from a meeting in Dharamsala, India with the Dalai Lama and a group of scholars where we were discussing different approaches to artificial intelligence, some having to do with ethical problems, but I presented there on a kind of embodied and active approach to artificial intelligence. So this is something of a recent interest of mine. as evidenced here in that kind of meeting. Concerning artificial intelligence, I mentioned in the preface one recent paper by Goudou, Noe, and Thompson, published last year in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. That's a short one-page reply to an article by Yildirim and Paul, but in fact, I'm anticipating the publication of a new book on the enactive critique of artificial intelligence by Noe and Thompson, which I believe will likely be published next year. So I think that this is a growing area of concern, and the enactive approach has something to say about this. So let me then say thank you, and I hope this has been clarifying in some way, and that we can continue the conversation in your classes, and that'll be the end of my comments here. Thank you very much.